The train smelled of coal, smoke, sweat, and nervous ambition. Men spoke in lowered voices now, even when they claimed confidence. The language of certainty had begun to fail them. Every station south of the Ohio River felt like a threshold cross. It and the rules subtly changed. Accents thickened. Conversations paused when strangers approached. Loyalty was no longer assumed. The man sat alone, hat low. Newspaper folded beside him like a prop. He watched reflections in the glass more than faces. Reflections didn't know how to lie yet. Virginia came into view slowly. The land greener, older, weighted with memory. This was not the raw violence of Kansas. This was ancestral violence polished, justified, inherited. Here, slavery was not debated. It was defended with etiquette and scripture and fear. He disembarked in Richmond under a name that opened doors instead of raising suspicion. He dressed differently, now cleaner lines, quieter colors. In the South, appearances were currency. A man who looked respectable could say almost anything before being questioned. He had business here, not with politicians, not yet with money, that the Confederacy did not yet exist. But its skeleton was already assembled: banks, railroads, arms dealers, plantation owners quietly stockpiling resources while swearing loyalty to the Union in public. The South spoke of honor, but it prepared for war with ledgers. The man spent weeks attending dinners, church gatherings, private clubs where men congratulated one another on moderation while discussing secession as a hypothetical exercise. They laughed often, too often. Laughter was how they disguised dread. One evening, he was introduced to a railroad magnate whose tracks stitched together 3 states and whose sympathies stitched together a rebellion. "You don't look like an ideologue," the magnate said, pouring bourbon. "That's refreshing." "Ideology is expensive," the man replied. "I prefer investments that pay out." That earned a smile. They talked of logistics. Quietly, hypothetically, how quickly troops could move. How long supply lines could hold. Which bridges mattered most. The man asked questions that sounded academic. They were anything but. He wrote nothing down. He never needed to. By early 1860, he knew which rails would choke first under pressure, which ports were vulnerable, which men would panic when cut off from communication. War, he understood, was less about courage than coordination, and coordination was fragile. He traveled next to Charleston, then Savannah, then Mobile, always a guest, never a leader. He listened as men swore that the North would never fight. That industry made it soft. That the Union Army was a joke. The man had seen the Union Army. It wasn't ready, but it would be. People always underestimated. What fear could organize? In Montgomery, Alabama, he attended a gathering that would later be mythologized as the birthplace of the Confederacy. At the time, it felt smaller, more desperate. Men argued over flags and constitutions while avoiding the obvious truth. Once begun, there would be no controlling what followed. The man watched Jefferson Davis from across a room, noting the stiffness, the illness masked by formality, the ambition burning behind restraint. Davis believed in destiny. That would be his weakness. In the spring of 1861, the man returned north. He was in Washington when the city felt like it was holding its breath. Southern senators resigned dramatically, as if performing for history. Officers quietly chose sides. Files disappeared. Promises were broken with handshakes still warm when Fort Sumter fell in April. The sound echoed louder in newspapers than in cannons. Crowds gathered. Flags appeared overnight. Men who had never held rifles spoke eagerly of glory. The man stood among them, silent. He had seen what glory looked like afterward. War moved faster than anyone predicted. The Union scrambled. The Confederacy improvised. Both sides lied about readiness. Both believed the other would break first. The man offered his services, quietly, not as a soldier, as a problem solver. He was assigned to a bureau that officially did not exist. Its funding was hidden, its authority ambiguous, its failures deniable. It was staffed by men too strange for regular command and too useful to discard. They never asked his real name. He never gave it. His first assignment was simple: determine loyalty among railroad operators in Maryland. His second involved identifying newspapers that needed encouragement or discouragement. By the third, he was coordinating movements that would later be attributed to fortunate timing. Fortunate. Timing had nothing to do with it. He rode with couriers. He bribed clerks. He intercepted letters and replaced them with better versions. He ensured confusion where clarity would have benefited the enemy once. In Baltimore, he arranged for a single telegraph line to be accidentally severed for 6 hours. 6 hours was enough. A Confederate unit marched straight into an ambush they never saw coming. The official report blamed faulty intelligence. No one looked further. They rarely did as the war dragged on. The man watched idealism erode. Men stopped talking about saving the Union and started talking about survival. The wounded filled hospitals. The dead filled ledgers. Generals learned. Slowly. Politicians learned not at all. He crossed paths with Elias Crow again in 1862, outside Antietam. Crow looked older, thinner, his eyes hollowed by things he could no longer justify. "Did we do this?" Crow asked, voice barely audible over the distant guns. "No," the man replied. "We failed to stop it," Crow nodded, accepting that. Distinction with a kind of weary relief. Antietam would become the bloodiest single day in American history. The man walked the field afterward, stepping carefully among bodies, noting how often death looked surprised. Later that year, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The man read it twice, not for its morality, though he believed. In that dot, for its timing dot, it changed the war's meaning, hardened the stakes, ensured the conflict could not end quietly, conveniently, or quickly. Some in Washington cursed it. The man understood it. You could not compromise with a system built on chains. You could only break a Torby dragged by it by 1863. The bureau he served had grown bolder. So had its enemies. Confederate agents operated openly in northern cities, sabotaging supplies, spreading rumors, plotting assassinations. The man countered them with the same tools. Once, in New York, he fed a Confederate sympathizer just enough truth to expose an entire network. Another time, he allowed a plot to advance far enough that its failure would terrify others into abandoning similar plans. Fear, properly applied, was efficient. When Gettysburg came, the man was not on the field. He was in a room with maps, listening. 2 reports arrived hours late, understanding before anyone else what Lee's retreat meant. The Confederacy would not win the war, but it would not surrender easily either. As the Union pressed southward, the man followed the destruction like a shadow through burned towns, freed slaves, unsure what freedom meant. Bitter civilians who would remember defeat for generations. He saw Reconstruction coming before the war even ended, and he knew it would fail, not because it was wrong, but because it would be unfinished. In April 1865, when Lincoln was assassinated, the man felt something unfamiliar, anger, not at Booth alone, but at the fragility of progress. How easily one bullet could undo years of careful momentum. How eagerly others would exploit the chaos that followed. He stood in the crowd during Lincoln's funeral procession, hat in hand. Watching grief ripple like a physical force, the war was over. But the peace would be another kind of battlefield. And the man older now, slower perhaps, but no less attentive, understood that history was entering its most dangerous phase. The phase where people believed the fighting had ended. It hadn't. It had only changed uniforms. Peace arrived the way fog did, quietly, unevenly. And with a talent for hiding dangers in plain sight, Washington draped itself in mourning and proclamations. Parades celebrated victory while amputees learned new ways to stand. Politicians spoke of healing, of reunion, of a nation reborn. They said the words as if saying them often enough would make them true. The man had learned better. Reconstruction began not with unity but with confusion. The Union had won the war, but no one agreed on what winning meant. 4 million formerly enslaved people stood at the edge of freedom with nothing but paper promises and borrowed hope. Southern elites stood amid ruins, already plotting how to reclaim what they had lost without appearing to do so. And the man was sent south again. This time, his assignment came with fewer instructions. The bureau he served no longer pretended to be temporary. It had a name now, spoken softly, never written. Its mandate was vague enough to be endless. Stabilize, his superior said. The man almost laughed. Stability required agreement. The South had none. He arrived in Mississippi under military escort and left it behind within a week. Soldiers could enforce order in daylight. At night, other rules applied. Former Confederate officers returned to their plantations, to their churches. To their networks, they smiled in public. They whispered in private. Whispers were where the danger lived. The man spent evenings listening in parlors that smelled of dust and pride. Men spoke bitterly of occupation and humiliation, of how the North did not understand Southern honor. They blamed scalawags, carpetbaggers, freedmen, anyone but themselves. The man asked careful questions. Who organized patrols? Who financed defense leagues? Who printed anonymous pamphlets warning black citizens against voting? The answers? Repeated by late 1865. The shape of the resistance was clear. It did not wear gray anymore. It wore hoods. The first reports were dismissed as exaggerations, night riders. Intimidation, isolated violence. The man knew better. He'd seen this before. In Kansas, when men pretended chaos was spontaneous rather than engineered. He attended a gathering in a forest clearing one night, invited by a man who thought he was recruiting a sympathizer. Robes were crude, the rituals theatrical. But the intent was deadly serious. They called themselves protectors of order. They meant protectors of hierarchy. The man stood among them, silent, memorizing voices, accents, ranks. He noted who gave orders, without raising their voices, who watched the edges instead of the center, who laughed too loudly to hide their fear when a black school teacher was found beaten days later. The local sheriff shrugged. No evidence. He said, the man left that town before dawn in Washington. He argued for intervention. You cannot negotiate with ghosts again, he warned. You cannot pretend this will fade on its own. Some listened, most did not. Reconstruction was expensive. Northern patience was thin. Industry wanted labor, not justice. Newspapers tired of Southern cruelty unless it could be sensationalized. The man learned that moral fatigue was more dangerous than hatred. He turned to quieter methods. He disrupted funding, exposed leaders to federal charges unrelated to violence, fraud, tax evasion, illegal arms possession. He leaked names to rival factions within the same organizations, letting paranoia do the work. Sometimes it helped. Often it didn't. The problem with fighting shadows was that they learned to move faster. In 1868, as Ulysses S. Grant was elected, President violence surged again. Black voters were attacked. Republican officials were murdered. Entire counties were terrorized into silence. The man walked through one such county days after an election. Ballot boxes burned in a ditch. A church door shattered. A freedman's family gone without a trace. He felt something shift then. Not despair. Resolve. He began compiling a ledger not of names, but of patterns. Which states enforced the new amendments and which undermined them? Which judges stalled prosecutions? Which generals looked the other way? He did not intend to use it. Immediately, history rewarded patience. When the enforcement acts were passed, granting the federal government power to intervene against domestic terror groups. The man finally saw movement. Federal troops arrested Klansmen. Trials were held. Convictions followed, for a moment. It seemed like the tide might turn, but tides depended on the moon, and the moon shifted by the early 1870s. Northern interest waned. Economic panic hit. Compromises were proposed. The word reconciliation returned stripped of meaning. The man sat in a hotel room in New Orleans in 1877, reading reports of the compromise that would end Reconstruction. Federal troops would withdraw. Southern Democrats would regain control. The nation would move on. Move on from what? He folded the paper slowly. This, he realized, was the true defeat. Not the battlefield losses. Not the burned cities. But the decision. To stop trying, he remained in the South for years afterward, watching as new laws replaced old chains with subtler ones. Poll taxes. Literacy tests. Violence disguised as local custom. Freedom eroded by design. The man did what he could. It was never enough. By the time he finally returned north for good, he was tired in a way no sleep could fix. It helped win a war. He had failed to win a peace, and yet he knew something most did not. History moved in cycles. The things buried now would resurface later, sometimes uglier. Sometimes transformed. As he packed his papers for the last time, he paused over a map of the United States. Worn thin at the folds, the country looked whole again. He knew better. Cracks didn't always show. They waited, and when they opened, they swallowed generations.